And welcome to this Mile-End Institute lunchtime webinar. As I'm sure you'll be aware, the Mile-End Institute is a centre at Queen Mary University of London for the study and discussion of British politics and policy, which is what we'll be doing today. So today, at today's webinar, we'll be talking about the political economy of the new Labour government. I'm Morgan Jones, I'm a journalist, I write mostly about Labour politics, and I'm one of the editors of Renewal, a journal of social democracy, and I'll be chairing the event. So we're 4 and a bit months on from Rachel Reeves' first budget in the autumn, and we're heading at pace towards the spring statement with concerns over defence spending and welfare spending dominating the headlines. So I think it's the perfect time to really get into this topic with a panel of experts. We'll be hearing from Dr. Colin Murphy, who is Deputy Director of the Mile-End Institute and a lecturer in politics here at Queen Mary, from Sam Friedman, who is a former government advisor who now runs the UK's most popular politics Substack, Comment is Freed. Dr. Kate Alexander-Shaw, who is a political economist at the LSE European Institute and works on comparative British and European policy. And Dr. Thea Bertram, who is an advisor for the last Labour government, is now director of the think tank, the Social Market Foundation. So it's a really great panel of experts. And we'll be having a Q&A after, so I'd advise everyone who is watching on to think over what questions they might fancy asking when we come to that section of the event. But for the time being, I'll hand it over to Colin, who's going to kick us off.
Great, thanks very much, Morgan, and thanks to everybody for coming. So in my 10 minutes, I'm going to break down the political economy of Keir Starmer's Labour Party, and I'm going to put forward an ideal type schema of the three emergent political coalitions within the governing party with divergent views over economic policy. And then I'll end by suggesting that the contradictions between them are sharpening in ways that the government will find increasingly difficult to overcome. And I very much look forward to the discussion. Before I begin, I should say that I developed the argument I'm going to give in collaboration with a former colleague, Dr. David Klemperer. And essentially, everything intelligent I say is due to him, and anything wrong-headed is my own responsibility. So this schema, which David and I published in the journal Renewal last year, originated in the 2024 Labour Party annual conference. So to David and me, the conference was something of a phony war over the true meaning of the just elected government's promised decade of national renewal. Organised factional warfare was absent. The Cormorant left had by this point been brutally exiled. But in the drinks receptions, panel discussions, and conference speeches, we saw patterns in policy advocacy and political discourse, tacitly competing viewpoints. And these extended from the grassroots through the Parliamentary Labour Party and the party's staff class and into the government itself. So we thought we would try and categorise them. The first viewpoint we identified was neo-Bevanism, named after the significant mid-century Labour politician Ernest Bevan. This outlook is most prominent in some government departments, in some affiliated trade unions, such as the GMB, and theorised by think tanks like the IPPR. Heavily influenced by Bidenomics in the US, this agenda centres on boosting economic growth, but also security through so-called productivist supply-side intervention. And what that means is core priorities for the neo-Bevanites are increasing capital investment in infrastructure and the green transition through, say, the newly created National Wealth Fund and Great British Energy. Now, as that indicates, many neo-Bevanites see aggressive decarbonisation as not just an ecological imperative, but an opportunity for economic development. Now, with this interventionist outlook, neo-Bevanites are statist in instinct, but they are far from die-hard Gosplanners. So they seem willing to embrace a contextually dependent mixture of regulation, subsidy, direct state intervention, and the so-called de-risking of private investment, alongside some targeted deregulation, with planning reform being a key example of that. Why do we name them after Bevan, the powerful interwar trade unionist known for his post-war role in founding NATO? Well, firstly, a central feature of this prospectus is fulsome support for the government's ambitious employment rights bill, supported by power brokers like Angela Rayner, which bolsters employment rights and strengthens the role of trade unions. For neo-Bevanites, productivity growth requires, in part, breaking the UK's dependence on cheap, exploited labour. And secondly, this economic agenda is tied to a hawkish view of foreign policy, obsessed with strategic threats posed particularly by Russia, but also China, and skeptical of hyperglobalization and interested in terms like friendshoring and resilience. And Rachel Reeves' pre-election term, securonomics, neatly encapsulates that combination. But securonomics wasn't opposition coinage. So 8 months after the election, what has been the fate of neo-Bevanism? The picture is contradictory. So on the one hand, the actual capital investment for things like the National Wealth Fund and the Great British Energy Institution is paltry. So for the latter, it's only 8 billion for the whole parliament. And it's paltry compared to the soaring rhetoric and to the fiscal scale of its chief inspiration, the Biden administration. And indeed, the reputation of Bidenomics is a little shop-worn in Labour circles now for obvious reasons. The government has also signalled that strategic competition does not preclude strengthening certain economic ties, notably Reeves visited China in January. On the other hand, the UK has used the geopolitical crisis of recent weeks to pledge rearmament, with an explicit eye on catalysing growth in unionised domestic defence industries, and the term military Keynesianism is starting to crop up in political discussion. Okay, so that's the first. The second tendency we identified was neo-Croslandism, and for nomenclature, we borrowed here from Anthony Crosland's 1956 classic, The Future of Socialism, which famously urged socialists in Britain to focus less on the structure of the economy and more on reducing inequalities. And today's neo-Croslandites are similarly not as interested in industrial strategy. Instead, they see egalitarian redistribution of the proceeds of the economy through the welfare state as Labour's core purpose. And in practice, that means anti-poverty measures, such as repeal of the hated two-child benefit cap, and also an influx of cash into Britain's crumbling public services. Now, neo-Croslandites are, of course, conscious of the strained fiscal context. That stuff costs money. But for them, this implies that the government should be braver on taxation. Neo-Croslandites are disappointed at the caution of Labour's pre-election tax pledges, which ruled out inter alia income tax, a wealth tax, national insurance, and VAT hikes. And they often express hope that Reeves will find some way around these pledges. Now, there are potential overlaps between these two tendencies. Many neo-Bevanites would support higher taxes if it unlocked capital investment, and most government supporters think you have to improve the NHS to get elected. So there are overlaps. Nonetheless, there are obvious pressure points, and the clearest is the extent to which true believer neo-Bevanites would prioritise capital investment, so infrastructure, buildings, over public consumption, public service pay, welfare payments. And this is crucial, if political or economic limits on taxing private consumption and wealth are reached, then those differences could become starkly apparent. Now, David and I suspect, due to the welfarist legacies of previous Labour governments, that neo-Croslandism is essentially the default outlook of the average Labour activist and perhaps even MP. So we see potential for backbench rebellion. Now, the government bought itself time in the budget by hiking national insurance on employers to fund a cash injection into public services. But since then, they have demurred from further tax increases and, as the news today indicates, are exploring cuts to public consumption, to welfare, and also to overseas aid. There's already been one ministerial resignation, and there is apparently growing discontent among the parliamentary party. Now, the third tendency we identified was neo-Blairism. Neo-Blairites share the neo-Bevanite focus on the supply side and on growth, and they certainly support planning reform. However, they take a more optimistic view of the innovative growth-generating potential of private enterprise, markets, and the putative technological revolution. So for neo-Blairites in particular, AI is the key to both unlocking growth and positively transforming public services. And this tendency, we think, is embodied in ministers like Peter Kyle and Wes Streeting, but also external institutions like, obviously, the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Now, this techno-optimism has wider implications. It means neo-Blairites are more oriented towards business and more skeptical of the role of the state. And it means also that they sometimes downplay the geopolitical dimension of industrial strategy, preferring to emphasize the opportunities presented by openness to foreign companies, particularly foreign technology and capital. In both aspects, one can see potential for clashes with neo-Bevanites. As an example, neo-Blairites are warier of the Employment Rights Bill, which they see as undermining labour market flexibility and growth. And in their coziness with business leaders and penchant for potentially disruptive public service reform, one can equally see sources of conflict with neo-Croslandites. Okay, so to finish here, I think it's important to stress that these tendencies are firstly ideal types, and secondly, they're not necessarily in conflict. In favourable economic circumstances, you can combine a bold supply-side agenda driven by government capital investment and regulation with redistribution and public services investment, and with an embrace of new technologies, and with a relatively collaborative treatment of business. However, the essential condition for such a synthesis would be economic growth. With growth, neo-Blairite concerns about the impact of labour market reforms would lessen, and neo-Croslandite spending demands can be more easily satisfied. And if growth proves elusive, the trade-offs between the different approaches will become sharper. So it matters, therefore, that since we devised that typology, the wider mood music on economic growth has darkened significantly. The forecast of the independent OBR, which directly determines Reeves's headroom given her fiscal rules, are quite pessimistic, and the Bank of England is markedly pessimistic. And it is an open question how far or how fast a domestic industrial strategy can overcome this pessimism, particularly given the UK's deep-seated vulnerabilities in its consumption and debt-led Anglo-liberal growth regime. Nor is it clear yet the extent to which the UK is exposed to global developments. Yes, it has a smaller trade surplus with the US, but its gilt markets are markedly sensitive to US Treasury markets, and we don't know yet whether we're looking at a recessionary or stagflationary prospect, which would really matter in that context. So to conclude, on current trends, it seems likely to David and I that the three rival economic outlooks we outlined will crystallize into organized groupings or sects within the cabinet, the PLP, and the wider party, and begin clashing openly over policy. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Colm. I believe we are now going to hear from Sam Friedman.
Thank you very much. So, hello, everybody. The reason I was keen to speak at this event was because I found that original blog post that we've just been hearing about incredibly valuable in understanding the way this government is working or not working so far. And I wrote something myself off the back of it for my Substack, which tried to broaden out the argument a bit and dig into this question of sort of incoherence and why the government comes across, even to people who are relatively sympathetic to it, as being incoherent and unclear in what it stands for and what it's talking about. So I accepted the kind of three categories that we've heard about: the neo-Bevanite, neo-Crossandites, neo-Blairites. I added a fourth, which I called neo-Blunketites, I think. But you could call Blue Labour or Old Right or something like that instead. Now, David, who co-wrote the original article, did correctly point out that sort of this kind of Blue Labour, old right philosophical position is not really about political economy in the same way that the other three are. It's more about sort of a wider political strategy or culture. But I do think it's really important as an additional strand in Labour thinking at the moment, both because it is influential on Morgan McSweeney, who is now, since the demise of Sue Gray, the sort of very clear lead advisor within Downing Street, but also because it has economic implications. If as a political strategy you have decided you want to take a more socially conservative position, target voter concerns around things like immigration and misuse of welfare benefits, that is inevitably going to take you into clashes with other economic philosophies as well. So it adds to this sort of sense of incoherence. In the post, I talk about why I think because you've got these sort of four different philosophies. All parties, of course, have different philosophies in them at any given time. It doesn't need to be incoherent because you can have a prime minister who very clearly backs one or other of those philosophies and stakes a claim to that position and clearly identifies themselves with that position and pushes it across the rest of their cabinet, their government. Tony Blair was clearly someone who had a strong philosophical view of his own. Magpied, albeit from several different traditions, and sought to impose it across his government fairly effectively. Certainly in the second term, he was in office. Keir Starmer is not doing that. Starmer is quite open in the fact that he does not see himself as being particularly ideological. He talked about being unburdened by doctrine in his initial speech on the steps of Downing Street. It is he is known not to enjoy discussions about strategy and philosophy, preferring to engage with sort of concrete decisions and what, as he was talking about today in his speech, what works. And as a result, what you've seen is the growth of these philosophical positions, these different philosophical positions with Labour, but not matched by a clear position from the Prime Minister, which, because the number 10's control over the rest of government is so incredibly reliant on Prime Minister's patronage, and because it's incredibly difficult for advisors in Downing Street to direct the behaviour of other departments if those other departments don't really believe it's the Prime Minister behind those requests, you are seeing departments go off in all sorts of different directions. And so it's not that nothing is happening or that Labour aren't doing anything. They're doing a huge amount of stuff. It's just often in different directions. So just three quick examples of this incoherence. I think the disability benefit cuts, which seem to be coming pretty soon, are a great example because they're incoherent in two different directions. Firstly, you've got a clash with the kind of neo-Bevanite employment reforms. So you've got an increase in living wage, you've got new workers' rights, you've got an increase in national insurance contributions, all happening, which is reducing the likelihood that companies will hire low-wage employees or will perhaps seek to reduce the number of low-wage employees. And in fact, the Treasury has argued explicitly that that's kind of its purpose, to increase productivity. At the same time, you have a set of disability reforms that's predicated on helping disabled people into exactly the type of low-wage jobs that you're destroying as a result of your economic policy. So it's completely, so you've got a kind of Blairite, neo-Blairite disability policy, which is in fact pretty much identical to the actual policy pursued by the Blair government, and a neo-Bevanite economic policy that just clashes with it, and at the same time a neo-Crosslandite belief within the party that it is cruel and unfair to attack the poorest in society, the most vulnerable, in order to make any savings you might need. Don't really believe the argument this is about getting people into work. Think it's about savings and avoiding making those tax increases. And you've also got a kind of blue Labour view on this, that the public expects to see a crackdown on welfare abuse and people not working when they could be as well. So it's sort of all four different traditions are fighting all at the same time within that one sort of policy space. A couple of other examples, I think I mentioned immigration already as being a sort of something that McSweeney's keen on doing more about, but you've got the classic problem that the last government had as well, which is it just goes straight up against Treasury concerns about economic growth. And it's just another trade-off that Starmer seems to want both sides of the trade-off and is unwilling to engage in the fact that there is a trade-off there. So you've got a kind of policy paralysis on that point. Another example, which is more to do with public service reform rather than economy per se, has an effect on the economy. We're streeting at the Department of Health following quite a Blairite model. Again, literally the same policy on targets that Blair had back in 2004. In the Department of Education, you've got Bridget Phillipson pursuing a bill which seems to move away from the Blairite model of academies being having different powers to maintain schools. So you've got all these departments running off in different directions and a real lack of clarity from the centre, which ultimately has to come from the Prime Minister because number 10 isn't strong enough to do it without that prime ministerial support. As per the authors of the original piece, I do think the sort of really big issue, and this is sort of how I concluded my post, is the fact that most of the party and a lot of MPs and a lot of the more active voters for Labour are essentially neo-Crosslandite, want to see social spending on social policy, whether that's health, whether that's benefits, getting rid of the two-child limit, etc., etc. And at some point, Labour is going to get so unpopular and the leadership is going to get so unpopular that there is a rebellion, that the tension that is growing and growing there snaps, and you get a confrontation between the party leadership and a large group of MPs. It might happen over disability benefits. If it doesn't, it will happen over something else in the longer run. Ultimately, leaderships that try and position themselves away from where their party the bulk of their parties are. They're given some rope to pull away from, a bit of a bungee rope to pull away from their party. They're given a bit of permission to do that if they've won an election, but it will snap back at some point because ultimately parties are in control of their leaders and not the other way around, as the Conservatives found to their misfortune, and Tony Blair eventually found as well, even though he was doing a lot better in the polls than Keir Starmer is. So I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about Labour's incoherence, and I do think that incoherence will lead to a fairly big clash in the future.
Thank you very much. I believe we're now moving on to Dr. Kate Alexander-Shaw.
Oh, thanks, Morgan, and thank you, Colin, for organising this really timely discussion. I think it's a good moment to be having it. I want to say a little bit about this question of incoherence and whether Labour have a coherent economic policy. Now we know a bit more about what they want to do in government, and if it is incoherent, what they can do about it. But I think I should start by acknowledging the extraordinarily difficult context within which Starmer and Rachel Reeves are operating. I mean, there's just no doubt that the inheritance in terms of both the fiscal position and the kind of social inheritance, the sort of the state of public services as they come in is an extraordinarily difficult set of things to confront, and that any government in this context would be up against some difficult choices. And then you add on all the kind of new headwinds in the global economy, particularly since the US election, and everything that might be kind of making the context more difficult, and particularly trying to achieve growth in the UK in the context of all that global disruption looks more difficult than ever. So none of what I'm going to go on to say denies that context, but rather I think I want to suggest that precisely because the context is so difficult, it's even more important that Labour have a kind of coherent vision for their economic strategy, that they have a coherent set of priorities and a sort of set of guiding ideas within which they can both make and sell the tough choices that they're going to have to deliver on. So is a government strategy coherent at this point? And we do know a bit more now that they've been in government a few months. I wrote a piece in Renewal magazine in the autumn last year, tackling this question of coherence. And at that time, more or less all we had to go on was Rachel Reeves's May's lecture from last year, which, you know, we were all kind of reading the runes of what their economic philosophy might be and what it might imply. And we know a bit more now. You know, they're in government, they're making policy choices, so we can update that analysis a little bit. But I think I want to suggest there are kind of two fundamental points of incoherence in the economic strategy as it appears at the moment. And the first is a kind of big internal contradiction that I talked about in that Renewal piece that's stopping them from doing certain things. But the second kind of incoherent front is about this sort of absence of the guiding principles within which they, and particularly the public, can make sense of what they're doing. So I'll take those in turn. On the internal contradiction, what I suggested in Renewal and will suggest now is that they have a kind of diagnosis of what the UK economy needs, and they are unable to prescribe the investment that would respond to that diagnosis because the fiscal rules are such a serious constraint on what they can spend. So you know, it was really clear in Rachel Reeves's May's lecture and in the things she said since in her conference speech and the autumn budget that they know that underinvestment has been the great weakness of the UK economy for a long time, that it hampers productivity, that it's holding back a kind of post-pandemic renewal. All these things come down to kind of long-term structural underinvestment in Britain and its kind of economic future. But when you, on the other hand, have a set of fiscal rules that radically constrain what the government can borrow for, and those rules and the kind of maintenance and meeting of those rules is the top headline economic message of the government, then your ability to respond with investment is very, very limited indeed. So this kind of enormous internal contradiction between knowing that investment is important and being unable to fund any. As a sort of oversimplification, but the point stands. Now, the way out of that Gordian knot is growth. As Colin said, if growth comes along, if the economy becomes, it starts growing faster, then the political factions are less at odds with each other, but also the kind of fiscal arithmetic is much, much easier. You've got buoyant revenues to play with, and your debt is shrinking as a proportion of your now larger economy. So growth solves everything. But the question is, can they get it, particularly in the context of all these global headwinds? So this comes through then to the kind of second part of the analysis of whether they can have a coherent strategy for growth. They've been very, very clear that growth is the priority and that they're prepared to be quite ruthless in pursuing it. But I think what's been less evident so far, at least, is a sense of what their kind of theory of good growth is. Is any growth good? Will they simply take whatever they can get? Will any growth delivering sector get their support, or are they trying to shape the economy in ways that prioritize, other things, environmental outcomes, quality jobs? There are many different things you might prioritize within an economic strategy. And just saying you're pursuing growth leaves all of those questions unanswered. So it remains a little bit unclear what their kind of theory of good growth might be. And within that, kind of what trade-offs they're prepared to make and how we and the public should understand those trade-offs. So what is the economic story beyond growth is a good thing, and we definitely want it, not least because it solves our political and fiscal problems. Now, there was sort of some acknowledgement, the Prime Minister made a speech just this morning where there was some acknowledgement that there were kind of tensions and that some of the things they're doing in pursuit of growth are going to be controversial. Massive planning liberalisation, for example, which will pretty radically reshape the relationship between local councils and their communities. It's going to be bumpy as the kind of planning applications come through in local areas. Those things will become politically salient in a way they haven't yet. And the headline message will be, well, it's all in pursuit of growth and we need the housing and so on. So there's a sort of certain bullishness about it and a willingness to acknowledge that tension and then just sort of ride over it. So there's some acknowledgement, I think, that pursuing growth means being prepared to break some eggs. But there are other areas where I think they're not willing to acknowledge the kind of contradictions or the trade-offs that are being made in pursuit of growth. For example, AI and the government's support of AI and their intention to have a pretty permissive regulatory regime for it compared to maybe the EU or other international competitors, is being presented as a sort of unambiguous good. AI as a golden opportunity, and the UK will be the first to seize it. Well, there's a trade-off being made there, and particularly for a Labour government whose traditional reason for being has been about jobs. Well, the kind of implications of AI for people's jobs, I think, are unexamined at the moment in their economic strategy. So there are all these kind of tensions and things underlying this headline of pursuing growth, which I think are going to have to come to the surface eventually. And when they do, the question is, what are the kind of guiding principles and what's the vision of the good economy that's being pursued that can help people make sense of it and ride through the kind of turbulence that is inevitably part of pursuing those priorities. So I think the big kind of risk for this government now, if they continue with those two kinds of incoherence, is that the short term is incredibly difficult, and there's probably no way around that. So the question is, can you make the public believe that short term pain is going to deliver long term gain of some sort? And if so, what does that long term gain look like? What can we look forward to if the government stays the course and is tough enough to push these things through and all that sort of stuff? Just being tough, I think, isn't going to get you any credit. It's got to be in pursuit of a better country at the end of it. So what, if the headline is national renewal, which is another phrase we hear quite often, what does a renewed Britain look like? What can people look forward to? And I think this is a sort of asymmetry that maybe a Conservative government, and for example, the Cameron-Osborne government, could get away with a sort of Britain must take its medicine kind of negative message as a way of explaining austerity and the choices it was making. Labour governments almost always have to offer some kind of optimism, some sense of what they can build, not just what we can withstand. And that side of it, I don't see coming through yet. There's the sort of grim determination in Keir Starmer's presentation of his willingness to pursue growth, but less of a sense of why it's going to be worth it. What could they do about it? I mean, if I were advising Rachel Reeves now in the Treasury, I think the tension in between the fiscal rules and what's necessary to get the economy growing and to get out of these political binds is a really difficult one. And part of the things that I would wonder if they were thinking about is kind of where they can create some room for maneuver within that fiscal framework. They can't abandon it. Their credibility is too inextricably linked to it now, but can you make some kind of maneuvers within it? For example, the distinction between current and capital spending is not God-given. And it seems to me that because the kind of investment that might get growth going in many cases has to do with investing in human capital rather than in bricks and mortar. But that would, for the most part, count as current spending and be out with the fiscal rules unless the economy is already growing. So we find ourselves in a situation where the kind of investment in human beings that would get the economy growing can't be afforded until after the growth arrives. So it's this catch-22. So could you think about this thing slightly differently? The problem they've got on incapacity benefits, for example, and the number of people who are still not returning to the workforce after the pandemic, including lots of young people, seems to me an example of an area where treating it just as a fiscal problem and attacking it just through the benefit system is a way of not paying for that problem anymore, but probably not solving it. Whereas a sort of program of investment in the COVID generation of young people to get them back to work, and whether that's through mental health care, training, whatever it might be, could, if it were a short-term program of investment for that specific cohort, arguably be seen as a capital investment to avoid long-term economic scarring out of the pandemic, rather than as current spending. These are debates that would have to be had within the Treasury, and they wouldn't be easy, but it seems to me that finding that kind of room for maneuver within a fiscal framework and recognizing that just saying you want growth isn't going to deliver it, thinking about what kinds of investment will deliver growth and how they can be made fiscally plausible is a big part of the picture. I think I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now moving on to hear from Dr. Theo Bertram.
Thanks very much, Morgan. Thanks very much for having me. This has been a really interesting debate so far. And I think what's sort of coming across is how resistant the government is to being easily defined. And I think some of that comes from Starmer's lack of ideology. I think Sam said, he on the doorsteps of number 10, he said he wouldn't be defined by a philosophy. So I think partly there's that. I think partly it's as a result of what Kate said, of just how many constraints there are on this government economically, and the complexity of the challenge that they face, including the geopolitical challenge. And I really enjoyed Colm's description of the different movements in the Labour Party. And I think those are all quite perceptive, and I can see those among the people that I know. But I also think the other thing you're describing there is how difficult it is to sort of apply one label to Keir Starmer's Labour Party as it stands today. So what we sort of have is something that sort of defies definition in our sort of classic political terms. And to some degree, I think all governments are incoherent and are not well defined until we look at them through the rear view mirror and we're sort of able to see them for who they were and what they did. But I think particularly with this government, I think Starmerism is going to be defined by the decisions he takes, not by an ideology or by a destination or a direction that he sets out in a speech. And I think we're beginning to see some of those decisions starting to be made, but we're still very, very much in the beginning of this government. But I certainly think the decisions he's taken recently over Ukraine, the management of Trump, starts to give you a sense of what Starmer, how he might be looked back on in future. So I think what we have is a political and economic approach that at the moment is highly flexible, adaptable, in pursuit of stability, and is actually quite patient in terms of, this is a government that's analysis of the problem it's faced. It was that these are problems that successive governments in the UK failed to deal with because they were too short-termist. And so if there was anything in what people were voting for with this Labour government, I think partly it was the idea of not just that there would be change, but that it would be deeper, longer lasting, more meaningful. But to do all of those big things takes 10 years. And yet, you have to have an election in 5 years' time. So I think some of that some of what defines this government is going to be how do they manage achieving those longer term goals in the short term time frame. I think they'll be very pragmatic about that. And so if I think about sort of the key decision makers, and I think you've got Keir Starmer as the decision maker, Rachel Reeves, in pursuit of growth, as Kate was saying. And then you've got Morgan McSweeney, who, like me, was a Labour Party organiser and worked on campaigns before coming into number 10. And I think, those three people are each thinking about things in a slightly different way. I think the combination of their perspectives is what's sort of shaping the direction. The way I think about this is in 3 US presidents. So having to say we should resist labels, I'm now going to interpret it in my own way through sort of pragmatic direction of 3 US presidents. So the first thing is Reagan. The first president is Reagan. And, the line is, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And I think that's very much at the forefront of those 3 people's minds. And I think the key thing there is where you don't get to ask that question as an electorate until you're nearly at the election. People don't pay as much attention to politics as we do, and they certainly don't pay very much attention until an election comes around. So Labour have got time. They can, as long as there is growth at the back end of this parliament and people feel it, then that will be the time when they ask themselves that Reagan question. So I think that's uppermost in their decisions and choices that they're making. But the second president that they're thinking about is Biden. And I agree with Kate talking about, I think it was Kate talking about, or maybe it was Carl was talking about the Bidenomics and securonomics and the supply side theory. And I agree they've sort of borrowed all of that. But the thing that shocked them about Biden is he lost. That actually on paper he did all the things that Reagan said you were supposed to do. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Well, on paper they all they were, and I think that's the second sort of thing that's keeping Labour awake at night is actually this comes down to what people feel in their pockets. And the second bit of Reagan's are you better off now than you were 4 years ago is it easier to buy things in store now than it was 4 years ago? And everybody forgets that next bit. And clearly that wasn't something that people felt in the US. And if you take the example in the UK, I know there was a period in the autumn where Labour was starting to get its act together in terms of its communications plan. It did a very good job at flooding the news with the announcements about how much global investment was coming into the UK at a global investor conference. And initially, Number 10 was delighted at all of the coverage of the stories about how much investment was coming in. But there's 2 groups of voters that they care about, and in particular, one is people who voted Tory previously and voted Labour this time, and people who voted Labour this time but at risk of moving to Reform. And among that second group, they reacted really badly, not positively, to all this coverage of big investment, because what it sounded like to them was, well, this is money for the big companies or money for the government, but this is nothing to do with me. That's not my GDP. So there's a real concern about how do you get over that? How do you make sure that what happened to Biden doesn't happen to Labour? So when you look at the budget and the incoherence of a growth agenda on the one hand, and then on the other hand, higher minimum wage, higher national insurance contributions, and more employment rights, and the brake that applies on growth. I think the way to understand that is among that group of voters, that's the one thing that they actually feel really positive about, that actually Labour is doing something to put things in your pockets or make a real difference to you by introducing those protections. So I think they want to deliver on the Reagan challenge. But they need to keep in mind that what happened to Biden. And then the third US president, obviously, is Trump. And I think geopolitics is hugely underestimated as a challenge for this government over the next 5 years, and was significantly underestimated before they came in. But there's a survey of CEOs who go to Davos each year about what's their top concern. And consistently for the last few years, it's been the cost of geopolitics. There was a period where Davos was, you get these big sponsorship hubs outside of the Davos Center. At one point, it was crypto. And then before that, it was green energy. But for the last couple of years, the key debates in all of those pavilions have all been, how do we navigate geopolitics? And that's where they are thinking, and that's right, that should be where Starmer is thinking. And we've seen already in the first few months of this year just how massive an effect Trump can have on our domestic policy, not just in terms of what's happening in Ukraine and the focus there, or in terms of trade barriers, but also if we're raising our defense commitment, that's going to mean a massive squeeze on every other unprotected department. So I think how he manages Trump is going to be a key part of his challenge over the next few years. And I don't think we can underestimate the importance of geopolitics. And geopolitics, you don't get to control, it happens to you. So I think all of that comes back to why a sensible approach for a government in the circumstances that they are in might need to be one that isn't defined very clearly, that is constantly shifting, adaptable, pragmatic, patient, and plays the table as it sees it. And although, like, my lesson from looking at successful governments that I worked in was that if you have a clear direction from the Prime Minister, it really helps in the delivery of public services and reform of public services. It's much better for a permanent secretary to know what's in the Prime Minister's mind and how to deliver that than for them to be unsure. But in the current circumstances, I think in the absence of that coherence that we're sort of struggling to find, actually maybe being pragmatic, flexible, seeking stability, being adaptable, maybe that is the best solution for a government at this time. And I'll leave it there.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can all agree that was a really interesting discussion. I would say, I might give my own short unsolicited comment. A lot of the discussion seems to have centered around, well, obviously the column's very good column, David's very good article, and which of these three kind of tendencies or mindsets will prevail. I would say that there's probably a good case for looking at, what has if Keir Starmer is unburdened by doctrine, if this is a highly flexible ideological, like a highly flexible government, someone gets burdened and, kind of people move into the space. And I think it's worth looking at what the party has defaulted to and what the kind of revealed preferences have been thus far. And I spend a lot of my time, have spent a lot of my time covering the kind of internal party and power disputes inside the party. And it seems quite clear to me that a lot of party management has been, it's obviously a separate issue to economic concerns, but nonetheless, it's kind of worth thinking about, I think, has defaulted to the kind of neo-Blairite wing in terms of both personnel and decision-making. If you look at things like candidate selection and kind of general questions of the NEC and party management. And so on that basis, I would probably put my bets on the default coming to, if no one makes a decision, someone makes a decision for you, the default coming to the kind of neo-Blairite tendency, partly for reasons of having sharper elbows, partly for reasons that it's just cheaper to say that AI will fix everything. But maybe that's a slightly cynical view, because I would also regard the kind of overall direction of Starmerism as kind of more in the neo-Bevanite tone. But anyway, that's enough from me. On to the questions. So the first question we have is from Stephen Broderick, who says, it would be great to know what the panel think of a wealth tax. It seems to be dominating a lot of conversations and seen as a silver bullet by different commentators, but how realistic or likely is it for the government to deliver, and would it work? Is there anyone who wants to come in on that? Colin?
I'll kick off. So wealth tax comes up a lot because, Richard Bergen, for example, the left-wing Labour MP, mentioned it in Prime Minister's questions yesterday as an alternative to the government's approach to disability and welfare spending, as an alternative way of escaping the fiscal constraints that Kate in particular talked about, right? The other way you can make the fiscal arithmetic work is by, at least in the short term, increasing your tax intake. And it's long been argued in the left that capital and wealth is undertaxed compared to income. Now, how realistic is it? Well, I think it depends on what you're talking about. The experience of a wealth tax in Spain hasn't been particularly glittering, at least compared to what is claimed for it. But nevertheless, there are some estimates out there by very clever people. So Aaron Advani, for example, estimates that a one-off wealth tax of, I think it was 1% every year for 5 years on assets over £2 million would raise something like 80 billion, which would give you some space. Now, I would add quite a lot of caveats to that. Firstly, you probably have to exclude the farmers for obvious reasons. Secondly, these estimates are inherently uncertain. And thirdly, this does create a trade-off. You know, if you introduce taxes on wealth, then you might disincentivize foreign investment that you need in other projects. So I don't suspect the government will be exploring a wealth tax anytime soon for those reasons. And the final reason is, while a wealth tax is inherently uncertain, we have a fairly good idea of what a hike in income tax would raise, and a fairly good idea of what a hike in VAT would raise, and a fairly good idea of what a hike in NI would raise. And those are the big three in terms of the UK's overall revenue. So if you are in a pickly point from a policy-making perspective, if not an electoral one, the big three loom very large.
Kate?
Yeah. Just to follow up with Colin, because I agree with everything you said. I mean, I think that you can make an economic case for a wealth tax. Wealth assets in this country are undertaxed compared to income now. It's pretty clear. And you can, you know, make it from the left. You can make a political case for it too, of course. But I'm pretty pessimistic about its prospects, not least because when we look at what constitutes wealth in the UK context in particular, the lion's share of it is property, it's housing, it's people's homes. And has very long been a kind of live rail in British politics. Theresa May lost her majority over it in 2017 when she just began to suggest that older people's housing equity might start to pay for their social care through some kind of, it was decried as a death tax, and it became politically untouchable. Council tax can't be rebanded, even though we're still using valuations from 1991, because that involves changing the way we tax homes and property in this country, and that's politically untouchable too. So a wealth tax that included residential property, I think, would be politically impossible. If you were looking just at other kinds of wealth, whether it's sort of shares and business assets, or the various other categories under the heading of wealth, you might find more political space. But whether it would raise the kind of money people hope for, I don't know. And whether it would therefore be worth the kind of political turbulence. To the extent that it could happen, I think it would have to be as part of a broader package of measures that sort of said, well, everyone's paying their fair share, and this is happening here and that's happening over there, not just we're Labour and we're doing a wealth tax because we're Labour. I think that would be very difficult. So yeah, I don't see a wealth tax that involved housing getting off the ground.
Does anyone else want to come in on that, or should we move on to another question?
Yeah, I agree. I think a wealth tax, like a singular idea of one sort of lump thing, I think is very unlikely, and I think would be I think politically it would be quite difficult for the government, economically uncertain outcome. But that said, I think a sort of series of smaller measures but targeting wealth are already happening to some extent. I mean, we see it with the inheritance tax move on farmers' properties, which is obviously already one of the few areas where we've seen the Conservatives come out to actually take a position on the policy, and that they're firmly against it. And I think we might see, maybe not soon, but over time, that sort of micro-targeting of wealth with a series of smaller wealth taxes. And I could see second homes being one of them. I agree, if you sort of make housing the target for your attack on wealth in an indiscriminate way, there's a huge potential political backlash. On the other hand, I do think that there are targeted measures around things like second homes and how you, particularly those that are not lived in, or where there are houses being flipped quickly. There are things that would probably command public support that you could do in a targeted way, and that might sit more easily with the idea of sort of pragmatic approach rather than coming at it from a more ideological approach. But it doesn't raise you as much money.
Should we move on to the next question, which fits very neatly with the last question, which is a question from Rob Saunders of Queen Mary, I assume. Should Labour break its manifesto promises on tax, and if so, how should it make that case to the electorate?
Well, I'll come in on this one then. They already have, because they did it with Nix. Employer Nix was pretty clearly ruled out under their pre-manifesto pledges. They've obviously pretending that it wasn't, but it was. So we've already kind of gone there. They feel like they have a defense on that one that they wouldn't have on just sort of putting up employee Nix or income tax or VAT. My view on where we are now is because of the difficulty of the fiscal situation, because of what's happening in America and geopolitics, they are inevitably going to have to put them up against. It's not a question of should they are going to at some point. The only real question is, do they realize it yet? And are they just pretending that they're not going to have to because they want to put some choreography around showing that they're doing everything they can, whether it's cutting civil servants and welfare and so on, before getting to the point where you say we're going to do tax, or whether they haven't realized it yet and are still in a world where they think they're not going to have to. But either way, they are going to have to. Probably as soon as this autumn, but if not, the year after. Because although they are doing things to try and generate growth, it's given the wider global headwinds, it seems pretty unlikely to be happening in the next year or two.
Anyone else want to come in on that question about tax?
Just quickly on the choreography point, I agree entirely with Sam. I've long shared a similar view. I don't know whether they realize it themselves or not. I guess on choreography, it would matter if a tax rise was forced or whether they brought it in. Both options are bad from an electoral perspective, from the perspective of the government, but the first one would be worse. And therefore, it matters. Things that are outside the government's control matter. So, for example, I don't really know whether the noises from the US are going to lead to a recessionary context, which leads to cuts in interest rates, which might then ease the headroom problem, or if tariffs lead to inflationary hikes, which then would lead to a stagflationary environment, interest rates hikes there, which would then have impacts on yields in the UK. This is very technical, but essentially, I don't know whether the UK government might be forced, due to movements in the gilt markets, to have to raise taxes, and that would be even worse. So if you're thinking about choreography and you know you have to raise taxes, as I frankly hope that the government do, then I would think about that choreography being relatively fast, because the uncertainty is such that you cannot rule out your hand being forced, which would, from a political point of view, and from the government's point of view, be disastrous.
Sorry.
I mean, I would just challenge the premise a little bit. You never have to raise taxes any more than you have to cut spending. The third option is always borrowing. So it's the choice between those three things that is always the kind of the way the fiscal maths had to be put together. It may be that at some point we hit a place where they have to choose between tax increases or borrowing, but those two things would have to be in play at the same time. But I think politically, the only world in which they do decide to overtly break that manifesto commitment and put up taxes is if you can say the world has so fundamentally changed since the manifesto that we're in a different place now and you have to start again because there's been some sort of crisis that justifies it. So I think the kind of moment that comes to a crunch will partly depend on, for example, what's going on in the US. If there's been some escalation in the conflict in Ukraine or anywhere else, a kind of moment of crisis that allows you to say we're back to year zero. Would be the thing that would unblock that, I think. But if it's just a kind of year-on-year thing of missing your forecasts and the fiscal rules biting a bit harder and a bit harder, I think that's a lot harder to sell tax increases in that context, and they'd have to find some way of balancing between taxes and borrowing.
I would say that the world has already changed fundamentally since the election, and the fact that it's Trump and not Harris, and then the behavior of Trump in the first 2 months of this year, regardless of what we expected, has been shocking and significant. And we are going to have to spend more on defence spending. And if you were a government looking for an excuse to break a manifesto promise on income tax, well, you have one. So if you're not going to do it then, and instead you're going to take money from the Department for National Development, which is something that Labour traditionally has always supported, then I'm not sure sort of what you're anticipating will be the choreography or the thing that would give you the space to say, okay, now we're going to break the manifesto promise. So I think on the basis of what they've done so far, I think they're going to do everything and anything necessary to avoid breaking that manifesto promise. I mean, I think it was a regrettable manifesto promise to box themselves in. You know, the constraints that we're talking about are made worse by that promise. But I think a lot of their credibility now rests on that. And while they were thinking about those Labour voters at risk of drifting to reform, they're also very focused. The second key important group is Tory voters who voted Labour. And at the moment, those voters are quietly quite happy with Keir Starmer. The reason why the Tories are not climbing and Labour is staying a few points above them is because those people have not switched back and they've not been disappointed in Starmer so far. So I'm not sure if, well, I agree on the economic pressures are going to force incredibly difficult choices, and ultimately they may not be able to be met by sticking to those manifesto pledges. I don't think they are preparing to break them.
A question from, well, I have a question from David Clanfer, seeing as we have been discussing the article himself and Colin wrote in this piece. One common response to the fiscal trade-offs Labour faces is to say that the government should relax its fiscal rules. Where would the panel stand on this? Would it be a sensible and useful move, or would it be a dangerous mistake? Are the fiscal rules Labour tying its own hands too tightly, or are they a sensible set of limits calibrated to reflect real economic constraint? If anyone wants to.
Oh, sorry, Sam, go ahead.
The fiscal rule, the main fiscal rule that we have around revenue spending is an incredibly stupid rule, and it has been an incredibly stupid rule for a long time. The idea that we base our current financial decisions on whether debt to GDP ratio is going up or down in 5 years' time, when we can't possibly know that, is a very badly designed rule. There have been some changes to it as a result of the budget last year, but it's still a pretty bad rule. I think the issue is not fiscal rules at this point. I think it was that we had stupid fiscal rules 10 years ago, constraining completely and putting a completely unnecessary constraint on spending when we could have borrowed very low level rates and used that to build infrastructure that we now don't have. Now, the issue is not really fiscal rules. It's the actual state, the actual cost of borrowing. It is now a significant cost. We're spending well over 100 billion a year on paying interest on borrowing, and it's getting to the point where the cost of that interest is making it increasingly difficult to ever get to a balanced budget at any point in the future, on the kind of assumptions about growth that we have at the moment. And because traders know that, it means that if Rachel Reeves went out today and said, screw the fiscal rules, we're borrowing a load more money, you would see a big jump in the cost of that borrowing, and that would just actually make the problem worse. So in a way, I think the fiscal rules, whilst they're a political constraint, are not the real economic issue. The economic issue is, what can we get away with borrowing? What will traders accept that we can afford to do? If you look at Germany, they're about to borrow a huge amount of money because they're in a stronger position to do so. America can borrow money for now anyway, with a worse debt to GDP ratio than we have, because the dollar is the global reserve currency. We are just not in a very good position. So I don't think the fiscal rules are the main constraint, and that's why I don't think borrowing is really an option available. I think they did a bit on that in November, which was right, but I don't think they can go much further, which is why I think ultimately it is now cuts or taxes.
Does anyone else want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think the fiscal rules, as they designed them in opposition, have been an incredibly unhelpful set of constraints, and they could have designed them slightly differently, but it is too late to do that now, politically speaking, and in terms of the market reaction that might trigger. This is what they are and will remain for the first term, I guess. The only caveat to that, though, is the European Union has just suggested that increases in defence spending will be out with the Stability and Growth Pact for a while. They're trying to make room in their fiscal rules for what they're essentially saying some crisis spending on defence. So even the kind of uber conservative, fiscally uber conservative EU is thinking about these things at the moment and sees the geopolitics of the moment as justifying a sort of fiscal loosening. So whether that creates any room for the UK to follow suit, specifically around its defence commitments, I wonder. And the defence commitments are tricky because they're pegged to GDP. So that's the one kind of spending that growth doesn't get you out of. If you're promising to spend a certain share of your GDP on defence, well, growth just means you're spending more, whereas growth would otherwise help pay for things like NHS spending and so on. So I wonder if that's the one area where they might say there's some wiggle room, but we'll see.
Colin?
Yeah, just so firstly, I agree with Sam. The fiscal rules are stupid, but they're kind of the symptom rather than the core problem at the moment. I agreed in 10 years ago, they were absolutely the problem because interest rates were much, much lower and we had much more space to borrow. I agree with Kate too about her points about defense. And I think that links nicely with Theo's points that if you were going to raise taxes, why wouldn't it have been now? My point here is this relates to, everything is possible in politics, theoretically. So it is possible that you could create a policy framework which would allow you to effectively force creditors to the state to take haircuts through one mechanism or another. So in theory, we could create a policy framework that would involve capital controls and higher inflation, which would lead to financial repression. That's basically what they did after World War II. So it's not true theoretically that there's nothing you can do. But it should be obvious from what I just said that practically it is not true, at least in the current context. And unless and until that changes, which is possible, it has changed in the past, the constraint is basically real. And in that context, you are then left with spending or taxes. Kate's right, though, that this is a fast-moving world, and it is not necessarily impossible that if the UK moved into a slipstream behind a wider EU initiative, that would open up space. That is not impossible.
A slight change in question. A question from Sophie Frew, who asks, what lessons do you think the Labour leaders have taken from the Conservative period in power? What is their diagnosis of how the Conservatives went wrong in the economy, and are these the right lessons?
I was on a podcast recently where I heard George Osborne praising Rachel Reeves as the successor to his austerity cuts, which I thought was a clever way of him twisting the knife on someone from another party. I think what the government will look at the Conservatives, particularly that era, that early Cameron Osborne era, as having done successfully was they prosecuted an argument. And that's something that this government has not yet terribly successfully done in many areas of its, when it's made big decisions, winter fuel payment, the farmers' inheritance tax, or the abolition of the cutting of the overseas aid budget to fund defence spending. There was no pitch rolling. They just made a decision and it happened, and with good or bad effect. But actually, I think what Osborne and Cameron did quite well was to build a consistent argument around their economic strategy, and I think they're keen to learn how to do that. I mean, I think the other lesson is Liz Truss, and I think the lesson of Liz Truss haunts this government more than any other recent Conservative Prime Minister. And I think they're really keen to learn the lessons of what happened to Liz Truss, even if Liz Truss isn't herself, nor seemingly the Conservatives.
Does anyone else want to come in on that, or?
I mean, yeah, I just very briefly, the Mays lecture last year, Rachel Reeves's Mays lecture, actually was quite reflective on this. It drew lessons not just from the last Conservative government, but from the New Labour period and so on. So there was quite a lot of sort of thinking in that lecture about how not borrowing to invest when interest rates were rock bottom was a mistake, about New Labour believing a bit too much in the ability of globalisation in the market to deliver living standards, all these sort of pieces of reflection. But as Theo says, the one bit of lesson drawing that is driving everything now is the Liz Truss moment and this fear of a market reaction. And I'm not sure how much analysis is behind that in terms of the kind of what exactly the fiscal space is, what exactly the space is before you trigger a market reaction, or just whether it's put them in a defensive crouch forever and always because you must project prudence. Because a lot of what went wrong in the Truss mini budget was not just about them having hit a kind of magic number at which borrowing is now too high. It was about the sort of speed and dash with which they went for it, and that caused all sorts of domino effects in gilt markets. So there were sort of technical reasons why things spiraled the way they did, but the way it's been distilled into a political lesson is that you just can't afford to be brave about borrowing. You must always make yourself small and not frighten the markets. So I think that, you know, whatever other reflection and lesson drawing's gone on, that one's in the driving seat now.
Yeah, just to come back on that, I think that's absolutely right. And I think this question of who is deciding how the market reacts, who's in charge of sort of who makes that decision about this is fair or this is going too far, is incredibly unclear. And it's not even clear that it's the markets themselves in a way, because you sort of saw it at the beginning of this year with a story about Rachel Reeves is in trouble, she's about to be fired, the markets are going mad. And the markets themselves are sort of like, well, not necessarily part of that conversation. It was sort of the interpretation of day-to-day changes in gilts and in the markets by political commentators, and because they've seen it that sort of some of that before, and so you've got this quite complex but panicky scenario, and actually that can spiral. So I think they are very afraid of that, but I think it would be incredibly helpful to have a very clear idea of, well, who's making these decisions and what do they think? Because often anecdotally what you hear from those who are actually making market decisions is they're reasonably comfortable with the government borrowing more as well.
Yeah, if I can come in on that, I know I'm a relatively hawkish one here, but that is completely true. We shouldn't reify the markets. One thing to watch out for when you read the FT is that you will see economists for hedge funds making panicky statements about gilts and the UK bond markets. And that is not an entirely neutral thing that they are doing. Nobody is, right? And they're economists working for particular organizations. And the interpretations they put on movements can also be a bit suspect. So they can point more towards domestic things like the fiscal situation rather than, oh, UK yields are following American yields. So yeah, we should always be suspicious of those things. But as Theo says, this is all about sentiment, as most things are in economics, and these things can take a life of their own very quickly if you're not careful. However just or unjust that is a kind of a political constraint, if that makes sense.
Just to really briefly, I completely agree that kind of commentary is also an intervention with its own economic consequences. And I think part of what was going on in that early part of the year, when there was a little flurry of headlines about was Reeves in trouble and was Starmer going to dump her, some of that was about commenting on the state of the economic indicators, and some of it I think was certain kind of news outlets with a right-wing kind of orientation just testing the relationship between Reeves and Starmer and seeing whether he really was behind her or not, and sort of testing out whether she was politically vulnerable. So there's a sort of political dimension to it as well, which is not always a question of the fundamentals.
A question now that we've had Colin's warning about constant vigilance when reading the FT. A question from Sarah Chapman, who asks, the lessons to be learned from Bidenomics are surely, in my opinion, that it doesn't matter if you effectively and objectively make people's lives better when people don't believe the evidence of their own eyes because of very effective propaganda on social media and in the legacy media. Is there a way for the government to deal with this problem? Or not?
I mean, there's a sort of objective and a subjective dimension there, right? Whose lives were made better by Bidenomics, and had it had it fed through to those people's lives in time for an election. So that's part of it. Economic change is lagged. It doesn't always come through on a kind of political cycle in the way you might hope it would. And that's a big problem, I think, for this government, is that the things they're trying to do to generate growth will take years to pay off. So there's going to be that gap between people's perceptions of their daily economic experience and whether the country's going in the right direction, according to economists. Those things might well diverge for a while. So I would hesitate to say that American voters were all just irrational and hadn't noticed how good they had it. And not everybody did. And you know, economic precarity in the States is a real thing. But yeah, I think this comes back to my point about how you need a narrative, how you help people interpret the economy and make sure that if things are getting better, that message is getting through, and not rely on economists to sort of pat people on the head and say, it's fine, really. You might not understand it, but it's fine. That's never going to work.
2 points. One is that I agree that sort of the economic sort of benefits might not have been felt everywhere, but also American government, central government doesn't have that much control over a lot of aspects of Americans' lives, whereas British government has more control. So there wasn't much Biden could do to improve healthcare. There were some small things he did, but he wasn't in charge of the NHS in the way the government is here. So a very clear, you know, I think probably the single biggest thing the government here could do to ensure re-election is to make it, you know, to really improve people's experience of the NHS, which people do tend to use on a very regular basis. The same is true for other public services. You can, you know, you've got more power of reducing crime, etc., etc. So there is a lot more you can do to actually affect people's lives. The other thing, of course, is our media is just nowhere near as polarized. And if you look at the impact of Trump arriving on the views and behavior of Republican voters, it is extraordinary. And there is no comparison with here. Like the number of Republicans who like Zelensky just fell through the floor last week after the row in the White House. That just wouldn't happen here. Governments cannot drive public opinion through media in the way that American governments can, or oppositions can. So I'm the problem we have here, which goes to one of the other questions I saw on the list, is that voters don't have any trust in any party. They're really, really miserable and depressed at the moment. You sit in a focus group, and this has been true for a long time. It is really, really bleak, and there is no trust or faith in anybody. Which on one hand, you know, if the government can do anything at all to improve anything, you know, the bar is set so low in terms of voter expectations, it could be a plus. On the other hand, it does leave a door open for, well, we might as well try anything else because it's also rubbish, which is the danger.
The only thing I would challenge in the question is there's a sort of assumption that people were deceived, that those voters were wrong. And I think it's a similar sort of mistake that the Remain campaign made about Brexit, that was obviously economically wrong, and that these people are being misled. And so I think we need to be very careful about how confident we are about when we look at government data or we see what we think is objective. And the example of that I would give is if you look at the growth of green jobs in the UK, Clacton is in the top 5 towns for the number of green jobs that grew between 2019 and 2024. And so if you're looking from Whitehall, you say, well, this is a place where green jobs have been brilliant. So surely all these people will vote for parties that support net zero and the green jobs transition. But obviously Clacton was the place that voted against that idea more than anywhere else. And if you look at it through the prism of Clacton, what happened was there was a wind farm built offshore. You're a very low skilled community. The politician on TV covered how much money was being invested in the wind farm. Skilled workers from other parts of the country and overseas came into your town, went offshore to build this. They didn't even stop to buy their packed lunch or stay in hotels, and then they left. And so you'd have every rational reason to feel that the objective evidence that you were being told was indisputable was wrong, and that actually, you know, you had good reasons for wanting to register a protest against it. So I do think we need to start from the point of view that voters are reasonable, rational, and should be understood rather than simply they've been misled.
I think we're about to be booted off the Zoom very shortly, so this seems like a good place to wrap up. And thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much for to everyone who attended. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of the questions, but thank you for everyone who asked one.